Bonsoir, mes amis. Or buonasera. Guten Tag. Guten Abend. Doesn't feel like evening yet. Although I did say bonsoir. Guten Abend, meine Freunde. Hello, here we are again. It's just after 5 on Wednesday. Yeah, I'm really struggling to know which day of the week it is these days, and it's not helped this week by having had bank holiday. So that's confused me, because Sunday feels like it was probably Monday. No, Monday feels like it was Sunday. So this feels like Tuesday, and actually it's Wednesday. Here we are, nearly at the end of this. If any of you have already watched a video, it's probably something like chapter 12, and I'm guessing if you're here for chapter 16, you probably have watched chapter 12 or 13. Somebody suggested I needed some Tudor theme music, and I fetched out my husband's really horrible plastic chanter off a bagpipe and found that I couldn't make any sound at all on it. I realised he can make a sound on it, but unfortunately at 5 o'clock every day he's still working in his office, and I don't think I can really, well, I say in his office, I mean in my office. He's working in my office. But despite having given up my office to him temporarily, I don't really feel like I can disturb him to draft him in to play you some Tudor music. So I'm afraid that opportunity, that boat has now sailed. Because tomorrow it will be the last chapter of the Falconer's Quarry. And so I will perform theme music for you. Especially for you. But we've got the penultimate chapter tonight, this evening. Today. It's not tonight, is it? The thing is, if I was doing this in the winter, it would feel like it. 5:05 in the winter, it's dark. It would feel like nighttime. It doesn't feel like it now because it's light and sunny and actually a bit sort of muggy outside. Not as nice as it was earlier, but there we are. I've completely lost my train of thought. Anyway, we've got the second to last chapter now and the last one tomorrow. We have, oh yes, and that's something else I say. That's the trouble. You end up developing these mannerisms. I'm not used to talking to a camera, although I'm a lot more used to it than I used to be. I worked out when I start the next book on Monday next week, it will be the 50th video I've made of reading, and there were a couple of other ones to begin with about what I was going to do and whether to do it or not at all. So I should be getting used to it, but you do start to notice you've developed these awful little verbal tics, verbal mannerisms. Not good. Not good at all. Anyway, so I often, when I look back at the previous page or two, at the end of the last chapter, I usually go, oh yes, because I suddenly remember what we read yesterday, or sometimes it's the previous week. Whereas, of course, if you're binge listening, which I think some of you might be from the way the analytics are looking on the, I look to see who's listening and how many of you there are, and you can see that there are people who are probably just going ba 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 straight through, which actually is what I do when I find a series I really like. So, for example, on the radio, You're Dead to Me, absolutely brilliant. It's about history and it's a sort of comedy program about history. The same guy who makes it, Greg Jenner, he makes Horrible Histories, which I'm sure lots of you have watched. And he's also making a one that's a bit more specifically for kids, which comes out on a Monday, called Homeschool History. I love that. Anyway, when I discover a new one of those sorts of series, I just listen to them all. And I think some of you are doing that too, so forgive me when I recap at the beginning of a video, because obviously if you've just listened to the last one a moment ago, you know exactly how it finished. The thing is, I read it yesterday, or if it's a Monday, then I last read it on Friday, so I have to remind myself, and when I do, I say, oh yes, every time, as though it's a really nice surprise, which I suppose it is, although I, as the author, am the last person who ought to be surprised about what's just happened. Anyway, yesterday, Joe ended up back in his own world, getting actually really anxious about witchcraft, because he realises that he forecast to Tobias that the Mary Rose would sink. And if he ends up back in Lucy's world again, and Tobias accuses him of being a witch, people this time are much more likely to believe Tobias. And then suddenly, as he's thinking about this, just before he falls asleep, he's not thinking about Lucy, he's thinking about Tobias and the witchcraft business, and suddenly he finds himself back in Lucy's world. And it's the middle of the night, and he finds his way to Lucy's room and realises she was asleep, which wasn't what he expected. He thought she'd been awake because she seemed to have called him. Finds she's been asleep, and when he says, well, didn't you just call me with the St. Christopher? She says, da da da, I haven't got your St. Christopher anymore. Chapter 16. You haven't got it? What do you mean, you haven't got it? It was Lucy's turn to press her finger to her lips. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and slipped her feet into her shoes. Let's go somewhere else outside. She wrapped a robe around herself and crept out of the room. Joe followed her down the stairs and across the courtyard. Where are we going? He whispered. Shh, just come with me. Slowly, quietly, she slid open the bolts on the great door of the entrance, then lifted the giant latch. She motioned him to stay still while she peeped out. It's all right, there's nobody around. Together they moved stealthily over the grass around the castle, the moon casting sharp black shadows beneath their feet. She was taking them towards the mews. Joe, hang on a minute. She was taking them towards the mews, Joe realised. Are we going to be all right in there? He muttered. What about the birds? We won't go inside, she replied, but if we sit down in the corner where the building meets the wall, anyone who does go across the courtyard, anyone who does go across the compound will be unlikely to see us. It's the best place. We'd be overheard in the castle or the garden, and there's no other cover out here. What about Tobias? Joe asked anxiously. He could be in there with the falcons. I doubt it. She reached the mews and sat down. Joe sat down beside her. I haven't seen Tobias since the night you vanished from here, she went on. But that's just the problem. He took your St. Christopher with him. Joe's stomach dropped. Took it? Lucy fiddled with the ties of her nightgown and didn't look at him. There's a lot I need to tell you, she said. Her voice shook. Joe shivered. He felt ice cold all over. I'm so sorry, Joe. She hung her head. I didn't just give it to him, I promise. I was frightened he was going to cut your face with those knives. I know you told me you disappear when you're in danger, but it didn't seem to be happening. I shouted to try to distract him, and then suddenly you were gone, and he whirled round and pointed his knives at me. Did he guess you had the St. Christopher? I had the purse in my hand, she said miserably. I'd reached down for it. You probably think I'm really stupid, but I was terrified. I thought maybe if I got it out and held it, it could work some of its magic to protect you. She hugged her knees. Tobias slashed the cords of the purse and yanked it away from me. He was so pleased with himself. He danced around, crowing. It was awful. And then he disappeared into the dark. She looked up at Joe. I'm so sorry. Really I am. Joe said nothing. A dreadful thought had come to him, but he wasn't yet ready to say it aloud. What else has happened since I was here? He asked instead. Matthew... Lucy's eyes filled with tears. She swallowed. Matthew died 2 weeks ago. Oh, no. So he went on the Mary Rose after all? Lucy sniffed. No, it was the scratches from the falcon. Foul humours got into them. They went red and hot, and poison started seeping out. She stifled a sob. They tried everything, but a few days later he was dead. But that isn't possible, Joe cried. People don't die from scratches. Of course they do, Lucy said flatly. I just keep thinking, if only I'd had your St. Christopher, I could have shown it to him. I could have made him better, like I did with Anne. Joe bit his tongue to stop himself saying that this was nonsense. There was no point. It wouldn't bring him back or make anything better. I'm sorry, Lucy, he said, patting her arm awkwardly. That must be terrible. They were both silent. Eventually, Joe said, What about the servant boy, Robert? What happened to him? They let him go, Lucy said, drying her eyes. The manservant got back from Nunny the day after you disappeared, and it was just like you said it would be. Sir William Paulet had never heard of you, and he hadn't lost a horse, or even any livery as far as he knew, so there was no crime, and no need for punishment. Joe whistled beneath his breath. Thank goodness for that. What do they think about me? She shrugged. They decided you must be some kind of deceiver, especially since you'd disappeared. They were mystified by how you came to have Paulet's crest, but since you were nowhere to be found, there wasn't anything they could do. Do they think I'm a witch? No, why would they? Because of me telling you about the Mary Rose. I even let it slip to Tobias by mistake. She shrugged again. I haven't heard anything about that. And what about me disappearing? She half smiled. That was very strange. One moment you were there, and the next you weren't. You didn't fade out. You were just gone, with nothing to show you'd ever been there at all. But nobody saw. Sorry, the thing's just notified me that it lost its connection. I'll just go back a bit. I'm just going to go back a bit. She half smiled. That was very strange. Sorry, he said, what about me disappearing? She half smiled. That was very strange. One moment you were there, and the next you weren't. You didn't fade out, you were just gone, with nothing to show you'd ever been there at all. But nobody saw except me and Tobias. Joe took a deep breath. I'm going to have to find him, he said. Why? I have to get the St. Christopher back. Really? She was clearly doubtful. He could be anywhere, and he won't just hand it over, even if you do find him. But without it, I'll never get back into the past again, and also... Joe stopped. What? He shuddered. I think he must have called me here this time. How? I don't understand. The same way you usually do. That's the thing. I was thinking about him earlier on, not you. So I was really surprised to find myself here again. But if he was holding the St. Christopher, and he happened to be thinking about me while I was thinking about him, he'll have called me here, without even knowing he's done it. She was quiet. Then she said, Does that mean he's nearby? No, unfortunately not, Joe answered. When I come back into your world, I reappear exactly where I disappeared. So I turned up over there in the middle of the grass, where we were when Tobias threatened me. But he could be anywhere. What, miles away, you mean? I think so. How long has he been gone? Lucy thought for a moment. It must be nearly a month. It feels longer because of Matthew. Her voice quavered again. She cleared her throat. Yes, that's right. At dawn it'll be the 20th of July. The 20th, Joe repeated slowly. So that's why you haven't heard. What? The Mary Rose. It went down on the 19th of July. I checked. That's yesterday morning. The news obviously hasn't reached here yet. Lucy looked at him straight. I really don't care, Joe, she said. Matthew wasn't on it, but he's still dead. Joe nodded, chastened. He felt sure the date was important somehow, but he could see why it meant nothing to her. Anyway, she continued, you'll have to forget about your St. Christopher. I can't, though. He sat up. What's happened now, with him calling me back, could easily happen again. And either I'll get stuck here in a world I don't belong in, or I'll have to get myself into trouble on purpose just to get home. It'll only stop if Tobias loses the St. Christopher, or if he doesn't think about me any more. He bit his lip. And then I'll never see you again. He glanced at Lucy and then looked quickly away. I don't want that, he muttered. There was a pause. He felt her hand on his arm. I don't want it either, she said shyly. She took her hand away again. What will you do then? Joe rubbed his sleeve where she had touched it. I'll have to try and follow his tracks. Maybe he told people down in the village where he was going. I'll start by asking there. Someone might have seen him or heard a rumour of where he went. I could come with you, Lucy said. Joe smiled. That's really nice of you, but I don't think it's a good idea. People will recognise you for miles around. Not if I wear some kind of disguise. You could go ahead, and I could follow and meet you. Perhaps. Joe was dubious. You'll need different clothes too, she pointed out. You can't go on wearing that jerkin. The colour and crest will make you much too obvious. There might be something in the mews, and there should be a bow and arrows. Tobias used to shoot rats to feed to the birds. But I can't shoot, Joe objected. I've only ever done archery once. All the same, she insisted, it might come in useful if Tobias hasn't already taken it with him. If it isn't there, we should at least find the knives he used for cutting up the meat and the coping tools. Coping tools? Like clippers, for trimming the birds' beaks. They're really sharp. I'm sure Tobias won't have dared take them. She looked at the sky. There was a faint greyness in the east, though the stars were still bright. She jumped to her feet. Goodness, I hadn't noticed it was starting to get light. Come on, we haven't got long. Joe hurried after Lucy along the front of the building to the door at the other end. Presumably she was worried that Anne would wake up soon and notice she wasn't there. She led the way into the mews, letting the door swing softly shut behind them. Joe waited for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The whole building was a single room, divided in two lengthways. In front of them, the left half was like a kind of open corridor, with slats in the front wall part way along. Stripes of moonlight fell across two tall wooden workbenches, which were pushed up against the wall. Beyond, the far end of the mews was in deep shadow. The right-hand half of the building was given over to the falcons, each of the 8 roosting on its own perch, not too close to the next bird. For a moment Joe thought they'd all had their heads chopped off, before he realised that they were tucked beneath their wings while the birds slept. All of a sudden he felt an arm around his throat. He staggered backwards. The building wasn't empty after all. Someone must have been waiting behind the door, pressed up against the wall. "You again," hissed a voice in his ear. "How is it that you vanish, but you don't stay gone?" Joe choked. He clawed at the arm, crushing his windpipe. Lucy spun round. "Tobias," she gasped, "what are you doing here?" "Good morrow, Mistress Lucy," murmured Tobias with mock politeness. "Wherever the impostor is, you're never far away." "How long have you been here?" she cried. "Long enough to have heard every word you said to each other. It was kind of you to make your plan so plain." He nodded to the shadows at the far end of the building, right on the other side of the wall from me. Joe writhed in Tobias's grasp, spluttering. But he knew he wouldn't get closer to Tobias than this. With his right arm, he reached backwards over his shoulder, feeling for the chain around the other boy's neck. Tobias laughed softly. "You didn't think I'd still be wearing the St. Christopher, not after listening to you. No, I've hidden it where you'll not find it." Abruptly, he shoved Joe away from him. Joe tripped and fell, coughing, on the earth floor. His throat hurt, but it was a relief to be able to breathe again. He drank great gulps of air. Tobias towered over him. "I just wanted to be sure that you didn't have any kind of weapon on you," he said. "I thought not, from the way you were talking." He nodded to the empty racks on the end wall beside the door. "But you did give me just enough time to collect all the tools." He twitched his jerkin open to show 3 knives tucked into his belt on one side, and 2 pairs of savage clippers on the other. "Does look like the odds are stacked in my favour," he gloated, "even if there are 2 of you to just 1 of me." Joe saw Lucy's eyes searching along the front wall beside the slats. The bow and arrows are gone as well, Mistress Lucy. Tobias smiled regretfully. What a pity, to have to put such things out of your reach. I had such high hopes of you. He stood with his feet apart and his hands on his hips, supremely confident. Joe tried to guess what he was going to do next. If Tobias decided to attack, he would have every advantage. Joe would have nothing but his wits to rely on. High hopes, Lucy was saying, puzzled. I thought you trusted me, Tobias said, like my birds. I thought you knew I would protect you and provide for you. Provide for me? What do you mean? Stranger things have happened. Tobias put on a hurt voice. Look at Wolsey, look at Cromwell, sons of a butcher and a blacksmith. If they could rise to become the most powerful men in the land, why should I, a humble falconer, not marry the daughter of a nobleman? You wanted to marry me? Lucy was astonished. But she's only 11, Joe exclaimed. Tobias narrowed his eyes, impatient at the interruption. All in good time, he growled. These things don't happen overnight. I was planning for the future, 5 or 10 years hence, and it was going well until you came along. But how could you think of such a thing? Lucy cried. Keep your voice down, Mistress Lucy, or you'll disturb my falcons. Tobias bristled. You liked me, didn't you? You trusted me, until Master Hopkins appeared. Over time I could have won your affection. Once I'd made you fall in love with me, I'm sure your father would at least have considered my proposal. Lucy stared at him, speechless. Why did you leave her in the woods, then, the day I first arrived? Joe asked. He had edged away from Tobias and got to his feet again. If you cared so much about her, why let her be ambushed by peasants? Tobias sneered. You've got it all wrong. It isn't that I cared about her, as you so sweetly put it. I don't love her. I wanted to marry her as a way of moving up in the world. But that's evil. You had better keep quiet, Master Hopkins, Tobias hissed, or I'll have to silence you. His hand went to his belt. Joe shrank back. She'd have come to no harm, Tobias went on. It was all part of the plan. I put those boys up to it. I was ready to ride in and rescue her. But then you came along and ruined everything. So you abandoned me on purpose? Lucy murmured in disbelief. Only to build on the trust you already had in me, Tobias said. But then Master Hopkins galloped in and saved the day. His tone was cutting. And then, as though he hadn't done enough already, he taught you to doubt me. I saw it in your eyes the very next time we spoke, and in the way you took his side against Robert. Even now, when he's been exposed as a liar and a fraud, you still trust him over me. He looked at Lucy, hoping, perhaps, that she would disagree. Wait a moment, Joe said. How do you know that they think I'm a fraud? You haven't been here since I've been gone. There was a fractional pause. Then Tobias said curtly, News travels. Everyone knows you don't exist. No one's heard of where you claim to come from. No one's heard of you where you claim to come from, and no one will miss you if you disappear. He drew one of the pairs of clippers from his belt. You know what? He said, moving smoothly towards Joe. This time I'm going to make sure you vanish myself. That way I'll know for sure that you're not coming back. He squeezed the handle of the clippers. 2 dagger-like blades scissored together, then sprang apart. If I cut you up into small enough pieces, the birds will devour you. They're always hungry. The smell of the meat will drive them wild. Joe glanced around. The falcons were beginning to stir, their heads swivelling towards Tobias's voice. As far as he knew, there was only one way out of this building, through the door where he and Lucy had entered, but Tobias stood in his path. His heart pounded. If he kept backing away, he would corner himself. He tried to quell his panic. Think clearly. Still Tobias advanced. He was nearly upon Joe. There was no more time. He had to do something. Desperately, Joe lunged sideways away from Tobias. The nearest falcon turned its head sharply. Joe reached out with both hands and pushed its perch over. The bird rose up, still tethered by its jesses. At once the air was filled with the beating of its wings. Tobias cursed. Joe ducked low and ran at the next perch, and then the next, knocking everyone down. He was away from Tobias now. There was only Lucy between him and the door. He made a dash for it. She screamed, "No! Stop! Joe!" And that is the end of the chapter. And we have the last chapter tomorrow. Last chapter tomorrow. I will try and be on time tomorrow. 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock, Thursday, chapter 17. Hope to see you then.